This program is made possible by the loyal financial support of the friends and partners of Family Policy Institute.
You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world.
Welcome back to the program. My guest in the studio is Michael Swain of Freedom of Religion South Africa, or more commonly known as FORSA or FORSA. Michael, welcome to the studio and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Errol.
Always great to have you here. We want to talk about a number of things, mainly the CRL Commission and everything that's been happening with that. Now, we know there's been a bit of a lull because there's been reappointments of commissioners at the CRL Commission. There's going to be appointment of a new chairperson. It may be the former chairperson, we don't know, but that's the president's prerogative. Correct. But I just want to go back, for our viewers' benefit, go back to a meeting that was held in Johannesburg. It was widely reported on with Christian ministers or religious leaders. And the CRL Commission was there. It was hosted by Bishop Moses Sono at Rhema Church. I think there was over 800 ministers. You were there. So we want to ask, what was the purpose of that meeting? How did it come about? And what was the outcome? So you can start at maybe at the beginning.
Lovely. Thank you, Errol. Yeah, that was a very important meeting. The CRL chairperson originally, sometime back in September last year, approached Pastor Ray McCauley in his role as the co-chair of the National Interfaith Religious Council and basically asked him if he could, with her, effectively co-chair a meeting, which would be a meeting of national religious leaders. And that was something that COGTA, in their recommendations earlier, when they released their report on the CRL's original report on the commercialization of religion and abuse of people's belief systems, they had actually also recommended that such a consultation took place. And in fact, the COGTA chair himself, and maybe in his personal capacity, actually supported that conference at Rhema. So the invitations were duly sent out, actually, interestingly enough, on CRL letterhead with Pastor Ray McCauley as a co-signatory. We were concerned definitely because in the build-up to that meeting, we felt there was not enough inclusivity, particularly from those people who had actually appeared before COGTA and had expressed reservations about the CRL's recommendations. But be that as it may, the meeting duly took place. It was, I think somebody described it as fairly robust in the discussions that happened at the beginning, primarily because the agenda was only presented the night before, and therefore nobody really had any time. And there was definitely a push to pretty much like formalize the agenda and the items on the agenda with a view to a declaration, which the CRL chair had indicated that she would want to then take forward into the national consultative conference that the CRL were having, which was about 12 days later. And the meeting effectively changed the agenda to a large extent, and I think in a very positive way. Just to explain the sort of outcomes, the sort of headline outcomes, the one outcome was that the committee that had organized that meeting would then be a steering committee, which would then be supplemented by other leaders so that there could be perhaps better representation on it. But very importantly, that there should now be a local, national, and obviously provincial process where the religious community, particularly the church, could be consulted, could look at the issues, which are obviously very important issues that the CRL's report had raised, and then come up with solutions by the religious community and for the religious community that would, of course, be voluntary and self-regulatory.
Okay, so one of the solutions that came out, there were meetings going years back now, about 3 or 4 years back, where the CRL Commission recommended regulating the religious community and putting in this very complex system of oversight and all kinds of things. And there was pushback against that, and they were pressing ahead with that, and they went to this parliamentary committee, COGTA committee, and they turned it down because, just for our viewers' benefit, what the CRL Commission wanted was for Parliament to amend their powers, to give them more powers to be able to be a regulatory body, which they're not currently.
Correct.
Right. But one of the things that came out, and I believe this meeting was about, this is what I was led to believe, is that the Christian church or the religious groupings must come up with a code of conduct.
Yes.
A code of conduct that then everybody must adhere to and respect and all those kind of things. So was that code of conduct drawn up?
Absolutely. In fact, COGTA recommended it. The people who, and many of the major denominations and religious groups who made submissions to COGTA had also said that was something that they would want to see and to participate in. And in April last year, the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa, TISA, organized a meeting up in Johannesburg at Christian Family Church, which was very, very well attended, also senior religious leaders. And that mandated the South African Council for the Protection of Religious Rights and Freedoms, who had previously, which I'm sure you're aware, authored the Religious Freedom Charter, which effectively expands our Section 15 religious freedom rights under the Constitution.
Yes.
And that was widely adopted in the past by some 22 million people across the faith spectrum and community. So the mandate of the April meeting was to say, let's take those religious rights and freedoms in the Charter as a kind of a baseline, if you like. And then what are the corresponding responsibilities? Because obviously if there's a right, you need to have a responsibility.
That's right.
And so they were then mandated to draft up the responsibilities effectively in the form of a code of conduct. And that document, that draft, was circulated widely, inputs received, comments, updates were made. It's actually currently in its third draft.
Okay.
So that's happening. That's a properly mandated process.
And everybody agrees with that code of conduct, because here's one
Yes.
of the questions I want to ask you. As Freedom of Religion South Africa, you're not pushing back against registering religious institutions and practitioners, which the CRL Commission wants to do, to kind of bring oversight to what is happening in our country with the pastors that are involved in fraud and money laundering and drinking of petrol and doing all kinds of horrible things. And so they're concerned about that, and they're trying to bring some kind of control into the situation. But the big problem is how you do that.
Correct.
Okay, so you support that there's got to be some kind of management over this, which seems to be out of control, with mainly foreign people coming into this country, starting churches and doing all kinds of terrible things. You want to see that managed, but how you do it is obviously the critical issue here.
Yeah, and also to make sure that the measures are appropriate. So, for example, the vast majority of, in fact, if not all of the really reprehensible things that the CRL's report highlighted, and even that we've seen subsequently with the Prophet of Doom, even in the Timothy Matoza case that's happening, as you know, these are criminal acts.
That's right.
So, the problem actually has been a question of law enforcement rather than there being a lack of law to control these abuses. If you're a criminal, you're a criminal. You cannot hide a criminal act behind some cloak of freedom of religion, like somehow God allows me to do something that your average citizen would be arrested for.
But now their argument, I've heard the chairperson, Zalavu, I heard her say that she doesn't, the commission cannot determine what is acceptable in religious in churches, for example. So when they brought in the one apostle, pastor, or prophet, whatever he was, they got water and they blessed the water and they're selling that, for example, for 200 rand a bottle. And is that acceptable, she says. But the church has to tell them. The church has to put this code of conduct and say, no, that isn't, according to the Bible, that isn't acceptable, because they can't make that determination. So that's why they're asking the church to get involved in everything. But I think I can understand that, but what you guys are concerned of, obviously, and church leaders, is the CRL Commission ultimately want to set themselves as the head of this regulatory body, where they're going to be telling churches what they can do, what they cannot do, who can, who cannot. I'm just putting it in simple terms, but that's what you're mainly concerned about.
Because ultimately, if the state is at the top of the tier, so to speak, then that is state control of religion. It doesn't matter what structures come underneath. But your big problem, of course, comes, like, how do you evaluate whether a religious practice is acceptable or not, and who evaluates it? So, for example, the Constitutional Court in the Prince case, which you may recall was the Rastafarian and that particular case, they made a very important ruling in that case. And they said that even if a religious practice or belief is bizarre, irrational, or illogical, and incapable of scientific proof or validity, that still can be protected by the Constitution in terms of religious rights and freedoms. So just because something is weird to you and me doesn't mean to say that it's not protected. The question is it illegal? So, for example, there's a big difference between my saying to you, here's some holy water that's blessed and, you can put that on yourself and God will bless you or whatever it is, and me saying to you, I'm going to spray a tin of insecticide in your face, because that's a common assault.
That's right.
And what we can see is that when the law actually is applied, which in the case of the so-called prophet of doom it was, he was convicted of 5 counts of assault with a view to causing grievous bodily harm and sentenced to a 3-year jail sentence or a 30,000 rand fine. Similarly, whatever the outcome of the Amatoza case is, he and the co-defendants are accused of serious crimes. That is not a religious activity. It's a crime. So deal with things appropriately. Let the state do what the state can do. But as soon as you start looking at practices that you think are a little bit squiff, often you'll find that a practice is based on a doctrine. It's an outflow of some religious belief or doctrine. And so the question, therefore, is that practice illegal or not? If it's not illegal, leave it alone.
That's right. Now, the outcome of that meeting with the religious leaders at Rhema Church, with the CRL Commission be there, and 800 ministers, what was the outcome? What was the next steps after that?
Well, the outcome was, as I said, a consultative process, which will really give the opportunity, which again, COGTA, when they released their recommendations, endorsed, the opportunity to look at these situations that have happened. And clearly there are issues where perhaps there needs to be a bit of tightening up. But again, what the religious community should be doing is to come up with solutions by itself and for itself.
Yes.
And let those solutions be then presented and endorsed and adopted, because I think
are they doing that?
Absolutely.
Are they?
Yeah, that process is underway.
Okay.
I know of meetings that are already, in fact, happening, particularly in the Western Cape, and I was in a meeting at Beaufort West, in fact, this past weekend. So discussions are underway, processes are happening, and I think that's a very, very healthy outcome. And then obviously the idea is for that to culminate, which was another resolution of the Rhema meeting, in a 3-day summit due to take place in October, where the kind of inputs can all be consolidated and then presented and adopted.
And this would be then the religious community coming together and say, this is what we believe should happen, and we want to regulate ourselves, and this is suggestions and proposals we're making. And the CRL Commission can accept that. But so they still want to be part of this, the CRL Commission, because they say they're mandated by the Constitution to protect religious communities. And so they should be playing a very significant role in that. But how do you do that? They're playing a role in it with the religious community regulating themselves. How do you guys work side by side without abusing or violating the guarantees of religious freedom? That's the one question, and we're going to go to a break now, so I just want you to think about that. The other one is, while all of this has been happening, the CRL Commission has come up now for re-election.
Yes.
So new commissioners have to be appointed and a new chairperson. Now, the current chairperson can be reappointed as chairperson because the president does that, and that's his prerogative. But I believe FORSA and some Christian churches have written to the president and say, please don't reappoint this person as chairperson because you believe she's hostile to the Christian church because of certain things that she's done. So we want to talk about that. We want to just flesh that out, your concerns with the CRL Commission, with its chairperson in particular, and then the solutions that you've spoken about. Just for SA, what do you believe are the solutions that's going to resolve this problem once and for all and put it to bed and be able to protect churches from these charlatans and all of those kind of things? Okay, so don't go away. More with Michael Swain after the break. Welcome back to the program. My guest in the studio is Michael Swain, the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, or FORSA. So Michael, we're talking about the CRL Commission, the meetings that happen in Johannesburg at Rhema Church with the CRL Commission and the outcomes of that. But the Commission is now reappointing commissioners and a chairperson. And in the last segment, I mentioned that you guys wrote, and a few pastors around the country wrote to the president saying, please don't appoint the former chairperson because they are worried that she's a little bit hostile to the Christian church because of things she might have said. So what is your view on that?
I think to start off with, the CRL should be the best friend of the religious community. That's what they're set up to do as a Chapter 9 institution. And unfortunately, there is certainly a perception that the current chairperson has taken a more adversarial approach towards the church. And even the way that this whole process began, with 85 subpoenas being issued for people to come and appear before them to give evidence, is not really the friendliest way to invite somebody to a meeting.
Yes.
And other statements that she's made, and the fact that really all the submissions that have been made to produce or to propose alternative views to the ones that she holds have been simply ignored and sidelined and marginalized.
So the concern then is that the CRL Commission is a Chapter 9 institution set up by Chapter 9 of the Constitution, and it's an advisory body, right? They've
Correct.
got certain powers to investigate, to strengthen democratic institutions, all those kind of things. But the one thing it cannot do is regulate.
Correct.
And it cannot make legislation or amend legislation. They can only make recommendations to Parliament. But now the CRL Commission has gone to Parliament and say, amend the powers of the CRL Commission so that we can be a regulatory body, which they are not. And that's what concerns the Christian church.
And I think very importantly, there was a proper democratic process before the COGTA Parliamentary Portfolio Committee to examine the CRL's recommendations and their requests to be given enhanced powers and to regulate religion. And that was turned down. So that democratic process effectively has ended. In as much as COGTA decided, reviewed their report. So I think the concern is that the CRL have basically come back and they are now proposing precisely what COGTA and a huge cross-spectrum of the religious community have said is not the solution to the problems. And that's where I think we need to perhaps try and move away, and maybe a change of chair would be helpful in this regard, so that we can actually have the opportunity without sort of almost constant tension to come up with these solutions.
Okay, so you don't want to be a combative kind of
Not at all.
relationship with the CRL Commission.
Not at all.
As you said, they should be our best friend. We should be working together to bring solutions. And one of the big problems in South Africa at the moment is all these charlatans with the doom and the petrol and the raping of girls and the laundering of money and all kinds of terrible things that you're seeing in the media all the time. That thing has to be dealt with, but you're saying how you deal with it. Now, there's obviously a huge concern about state getting involved with the church, regulation or any kind of state intervention in the church. Why is the church so concerned? And you guys, what are some of the examples of things that's happening in other parts of the world that makes you very wary of state intervention in church, in the church life?
I think just to start off by saying, importantly, the state has a very important role to play in terms of acting where criminal offences are taking place, whether they're done in the name of religion or not. If they're criminal, the state must intervene and deal with them. But in other nations, for example, and the CRL chair in her opening address at Rama at the summit alluded to the fact that unless her recommendations were endorsed, we should look overseas to see what's happened in other countries. Well, what has happened in other countries? In Rwanda, for example, the president has intervened, and he has stated that unless you have a theological degree, you cannot practice as a religious practitioner. And 6,000 churches have been shut down. In Angola, they've taken a similar view where you have to have 100,000 signatories in order to be recognized. And interestingly enough, even if you produce 100,000 signatories, every single member of the church must now pay 125 Rand per person per year for you to be able to continue. So they've also shut down thousands of churches. So as soon as you see, and human history, you can go back to the Catholics versus the Lutherans versus the Anabaptists, the Church of England versus the Puritans versus the Quakers. Every time you see state and any religious grouping align, it's disastrous for religious freedom. And that's why it is so critical that we keep religious freedom free from state regulation.
Absolutely. Okay, so going forward now. So we've got all of these issues, meetings, proposals. I think there's been thousands of submissions sent to the CRL Commission. from churches all over the country. Not only churches, Muslim communities, because this is religion. They're talking about regulating religion, which includes all faith groups in the country. So what is your proposal? What do you think is the best way forward to deal with the issues that we're confronting or dealing with in this country, with all the abuse? And I must mention that most of the abuse that we've been seeing in this country is by foreign nationals. It's people from other African nations that have come into this country, have started churches, and have been doing all kinds of things, because I think there hasn't been regulation as far as the law is concerned with SARS and just, are these guys registered? Who are they? Are they doing things properly according to the laws of this country? So what are the solutions?
I think one of the things which has been very positive about this process is that there's definitely an increase in fraternals, in sort of local organizations which are encouraging churches, independent churches, to come together in a greater level of accountability, and also to educate, which is a very important part, because I think that some of the abuses, in inverted commas, that were pointed out are simply people who have not done things that they could have done or should have done in terms of compliance.
Yes.
And so those are educational issues. So even with SARS, for example, if somebody's, I remember one church didn't pay their PAYE for their staff that they employed in ignorance. And SARS came along and said, correct this. And they duly corrected it, no problem. But when you're talking about how do we perhaps get some teeth to this thing? Well, we've talked about the code of conduct. And that's a very important benchmark, because if you're not prepared to sign off on, I agree that this is how ethically, perhaps, behaviorally, we should be as either an individual pastor, religious practitioner, or as an organization, there's probably a problem if that's, generally speaking, given acceptance. But secondly, and we believe the answer is actually almost sitting right in front of us, the CRL has an act of parliament that basically expands upon the powers and responsibilities that it's been given in the Constitution. And Section 51J of that CRL Act says that the CRL can keep a database of all religious practitioners, organizations, and experts. And they can require registration. But there's a huge difference between registering and being regulated.
Yes.
If I register, I give you my name, my address, my phone number, ID, whatever it may happen to be. You can ask for all sorts of information. But that does not mean that that's a precondition to my being allowed to practice my faith, my calling, to live out my calling as a minister.
Yeah.
And in so doing,
distinction.
There's a very key distinction.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, and like where are the teeth, one's been asked, in the registration process, you mentioned foreign nationals. So you could legitimately say, questionnaire, are you a South African citizen or a foreign national? If I'm a foreign national, I must produce my passport number. Next question, do you have a work permit?
Yes.
And if you don't have a work permit, and apparently some of these people who are starting churches do not, then clearly that's a legal matter. You refer it to the Department of Home Affairs, they do an investigation. If after due process that person's found to be operating illegally, they can then be deported back to their country of origin. So in many cases, I think what we're going to see is this database will throw up issues of perhaps non-compliance, which is an educational opportunity, or illegal activity, which is something which, of course, the state must intervene and do. But so it will definitely bring a high level of accountability.
Yeah, and that in itself, that registration and then being able to see people, I think, doing things properly would weed out the bad apples.
It can weed out the bad apples, and also it can definitely improve communication opportunities. It can improve opportunities for people to, be networked together, to even, if there are gaps, for education, as we said, is a very critical thing.
And I've heard through this process that, and I had Mr. Mafatsa in the studio here, who's the, I think the managing director, CEO of the CRL Commission. And I invited him to come down and participate in this interview. I wanted to speak to him first, and then I wanted you to respond to him. And he seems to be ducking me, and I think it's because they're going through the whole reappointment of commissioners and everything's in the air at the moment. So he didn't come back. But I want to make it clear that I wanted them to give their side of the story. What are they proposing? And what are the pitfalls and all of this? But I think when they started out, they were concerned about this. They did the investigation just for our viewers' benefits. they invited pastors from churches all over the country, and they interviewed them about certain things, and they were horrified with what they found. There seems to be no control. Now, I've heard that there are pastors and leaders of groups that want to bring some kind of regulation in, because they're also concerned about what is happening, the legitimate pastors and churches.
Yeah.
But how you do that is going to be, and I've heard also that denominational groups like the Methodists and the Catholic Church and the Anglicans and all these people, they have their sort of structures.
Correct.
And that helps protect and control things, that those kind of things can't happen. But what about the independent churches, the guys that are just there on their own run, without any oversight? How do you bring kind of structure in that and kind of control, not control, but regulation, just to make sure that there's no abuse of people and the kind of things we've seen in the media?
Well, I think, again, a lot of these organizations are actually starting and growing. So independent churches are increasingly joining fraternals or oversight bodies or what have you,
so
on a voluntary capacity.
Yeah. So is that one of the solutions, fraternals, for guys to come together?
I think very much so. We would certainly encourage that on a voluntary basis. The problem with the CRL's proposal was that they had umbrella bodies, and they were saying that everybody must be compelled to join a recognized umbrella body. Now, of course, we have Section 18 of our Constitution, which is freedom of association. Freedom of association is obviously rejected if you are forced to associate. If you can voluntarily associate, you can equally voluntarily choose not to associate. Yeah. So that was one big problem. And the second thing, of course, is who approves an umbrella body? Well, the answer is the peer review committee. The peer review committee is this eldership of Christian leaders, for example. Every faith would have a group of elders, so to speak. But so many questions, it's fraught with complications. Who appoints them? Who selects them? Why should they be allowed to decide what is acceptable or not? You can't do that unless you examine the doctrine. And therefore you're infringing on freedom of religion. It's just fraught with complications.
There's more problems being put out there than solutions.
Exactly.
And I think, Michael, the answer is the church working with the CRL Commission in a respectable manner. This is the proposals, the best way forward, and to genuinely find solutions, not one group trying to lord over the others. Like we want to be in charge and make sure that we can control and regulate and be the sort of head honcho in this kind of thing. And I think maybe that's where the CRL Commission was going, and which is wrong. But I think they need to work with the church, because all of you, as you say, the main objective here is to bring solutions, to weed out these bad apples, and to make sure that everybody's doing things according to the law, biblically, and that we're protecting people, because I think that is the main thing. So Michael Swain, the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, I want to thank you for the great work you're doing.
Thank you, sir.
Advising the public, advising the Christian church, the leaders, you're playing a valuable role to them. And we just pray that there is going to be a solution soon, and that the name of the Christian church once again can be restored.
100%.
Thank you.
Thank you, Errol.